The rain came down like God himself was wringing out the sky, and Beatrice Hale had not moved from her spot beside the broken plow for the better part of an hour. She stood in the middle of the south field of the Hale ranch, her boots sunk half an inch into the red Colorado mud, her dark hair plastered flat against her cheeks, and her hands pressed against the iron frame of the plow as if sheer will alone could mend what the earth had broken. The left share had cracked clean through at the landside, the bolt sheared off somewhere beneath the soil, and the whole implement listed sideways like a drunk man trying to find his bed. Without this plow, the spring wheat could not go in. Without the spring wheat, there would be no harvest. Without a harvest, the Hale ranch would not survive the winter that followed, and Beatrice knew that truth the way she knew the smell of her own hands, the way she knew the creak of the third step on the ranch house porch, the way she knew every hard and beautiful inch of this land that her father had loved before his lungs gave out and left her the sole keeper of it all. She was 23 years old and she was alone, and she did not cry. She had not cried in 6 months, not since the morning she shoveled the first shovelful of dirt over her father's casket. Crying was a luxury she had quietly surrendered along with so many others when Thomas Hale died in the winter of 1882 and left her 800 acres, a half-broke remuda of horses, 2 aging hands named Clarence and Pete who were more reliable than most men but still only 2, and a debt to the Colton County Bank that pressed against her chest like a stone every single morning she opened her eyes. The rain drummed on her shoulders and she stood over the broken plow and she tried to think. She did not hear the horse. The animal was big, a dark bay with a chest broad as a barn door, and it picked its way down the muddy wagon track with an almost delicate patience that belied its size. The man on its back was even larger, wide through the shoulder and long in the leg, and he wore a canvas duster that shed water in silver sheets. His hair was dark brown, thick and a little long, curling at the ends where the rain had gotten into it beneath the brim of a battered felt hat. He pulled up at the edge of the field and sat for a moment, looking at the woman standing motionless in the downpour beside what was obviously a very dead piece of farming equipment. Josiah Alden had been coming down out of the mountains for 2 days, bound for the town of Red Haven to sell 3 months' worth of trapped pelts and resupply before he headed back up to the high country. He had not intended to stop at the Hale ranch. He had barely known the ranch existed, having spent the last several years ranging between the San Juan Mountains and the foothills of the Sangre de Cristos, a man more comfortable with silence and pine trees and the company of his own thoughts than with anything civilized. But there was a woman standing alone in a rainstorm over a broken piece of iron, and the part of Josiah Alden that his mother had shaped before the mountains took him over entirely told him he could not simply ride past. He stepped down from the horse and led it to the fence line, looping the reins over a post with practiced ease. Then he walked out into the field toward her, the mud pulling at his boots with every step. Beatrice heard him then, the sucking sound of someone else's boots in the mud, and she turned fast, one hand dropping to the fence post rail she used as a walking stick on rough ground. She had learned to be careful since her father died. Being a woman alone on a ranch had a way of teaching certain lessons quickly. What she saw was a very large man with a great deal of muscle across his chest and shoulders moving toward her through the rain, and her jaw tightened. "This is Hale land," she said, loud enough to carry over the sound of the rain. "You are trespassing." He stopped about 10 feet from her and held up both hands, palms out, unhurried and calm. "I know it," he said. "I don't mean any trouble. I saw you standing out here and I thought you might could use a hand." He had a deep voice, unhurried, with something in it that was not quite a drawl. The mountains, she would later think. They had gotten into his voice the same way they had gotten into everything else about him. She studied him for a long moment. The rain did not seem to particularly bother him. He stood in it the way a tree stands in it. "The plow is broken," she said at last, not a question, more like an admission. "I can see that." He tilted his head slightly, looking at the listing implement. "Mind if I take a look?" She did not move away from it, but she did not say no, which he took as permission enough. He stepped closer and crouched down beside the plow, ignoring the mud entirely, running one large hand along the cracked share and then working his fingers along the underside to find what was missing. His hands were remarkable things, she noticed, despite herself. Big and scarred and deeply calloused, but they moved with a kind of intelligence that surprised her. They read the broken machine the way a doctor reads a patient. "Bolt sheared," he said, "and this share is cracked through. You got a forge on this property." "In the barn," she said. "My father built it." He stood up, unfolding himself to his full height, which was considerable, well over 6 feet, and she had to tilt her chin up slightly to look at him straight. "If you got stock iron and a decent hammer, I can fix this. Won't be as good as new, but it'll hold through a spring planting." She stared at him. "Why?" He blinked at her. "Why what? Why would you fix it? You don't know me." He seemed to think about that honestly, which she had not expected. Most men either said something flattering or something patronizing, and he did neither. "Because it's raining," he said finally, "and you've been standing out here a good while looking at it, and I know what a broken plow means to a spring crop." He paused. "I used to farm before the mountains. I know what it looks like when something's between a person and ruin." The word ruin landed in her chest with a small, quiet thud, because it was the precise word, the exact one she had been carrying around since November, and hearing it said plainly by a stranger in the rain undid something small and stubborn in her. "Josiah Alden," he said, and offered his hand. She took it after a half-second's hesitation. Even through the rain and cold, his grip was warm. "Beatrice Hale," she said. "This is my ranch." "I figured," he said. She told him to bring his horse and follow her to the barn. The barn was large and smelled of horse and hay, and the particular deep warmth that old wood holds even in a cold rain. Her 2 ranch hands, Clarence, who was 60 and bald as an egg, and Pete, who was 40-something and missing the tip of his left index finger from a branding accident years prior, were inside working on a section of bridle that had needed mending for weeks. They both looked up when Josiah ducked through the door, and Clarence's eyes went narrow with the caution of a man who had seen trouble come through barn doors before. "Who's this?" Clarence said, directing the question at Beatrice. "Mr. Alden," she said. "He's going to fix the south plow." She met Clarence's eyes, and the old man read something in hers, some careful measure of trust that she was extending, and he gave the smallest nod and went back to the bridle. Josiah unsaddled his bay and put him in an empty stall, and the horse settled immediately, pressing his nose into the hay with the contentment of an animal that trusted his man entirely. Josiah took off his duster and hung it on a nail, and both Pete and Clarence found reasons to glance his way, because without the coat it was immediately evident that the man was built in a way that suggested years of hauling, climbing, and surviving things that would have laid most men flat. His shirt was flannel, worn soft, and it did nothing to hide the breadth of his shoulders or the dense muscle across his arms and chest. He had a scar along his left jawline and another one curving above his right wrist, and these together gave him a roughness that was somehow not threatening. It was more like honesty, like a man who did not bother pretending the world was gentle. Beatrice showed him her father's forge and the iron stock she had remaining, and she watched him work. That was the remarkable thing, and she would remember it clearly in the months and years that followed. She watched him work, and she did not feel useless doing so. Most men in her experience treated a woman who watched as either an inconvenience or an opportunity to perform. Josiah Alden simply worked, pulling the small forge fire hot with the bellows, selecting his iron with an experienced eye and talking to her over his shoulder as he did it. Not talking down to her, talking to her. "How long has this been a working ranch?" he asked, hammering a piece of stock iron flat with long, steady strokes. The fire threw orange light across his face. "My father built it up from nothing," she said, sitting on a hay bale a safe distance back from the forge's heat. She had her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them, and her wet hair was beginning to dry at the ends in the barn's warmth. "He came out from Ohio in 1861. Was going to go to California, but he liked Colorado and he stopped. She paused. He was like that. He stopped when something was worth stopping for. Sounds like a man worth knowing, Josiah said. He was. She said it without embellishment because it needed none. He worked quietly for a while, and she could hear the rain hammering on the barn roof above them and felt grateful for the shelter without having quite decided how she felt about the man providing it. "You're a trapper," she said. It was not a guess. She had seen the packed pelts on his horse, beaver and fox, and something that might have been mart. "Mostly," he said. "Done a bit of everything. Scout work for a while, some freighting. Spent a season guiding a survey party up in the San Juans." He worked the bellows again and the coals breathed hotter. "The trapping suits me best. You go where you want to go." "And where do you want to go?" He was quiet for a moment, shaping the metal. "North and west mostly. Sometimes I don't know until I'm there." She understood that better than she could have explained because she felt sometimes in the deepest part of the night when the ranch debt pressed hardest, a counterpull in her own chest, a desire to simply walk into the open country and keep walking. But she never did. The land her father had built was the thing she loved most in the world, and she was not made for leaving things she loved. "How do you know forge work?" she asked. "Grew up in Pennsylvania," he said. "My father was a blacksmith. Worked the forge beside him until I was 19 and then I came west." He glanced back at her briefly, just a look, nothing more. "I was restless. The east felt too small. Did it help coming west?" He seemed to think about this seriously. "Yes," he said, "but sometimes one country just trades one kind of loneliness for another." She looked at him steadily, and something in the honesty of that answer made her trust him in a way that she had not yet consciously decided to do. He worked for 3 hours. The rain outside did not relent. Beatrice got up twice to help, once to hold something in place while he bolted it, and once to fetch a different weight of hammer from the tool wall, and he thanked her each time without any indication that her help was surprising or unwelcome. When the share was repaired and the new bolt set and the whole mechanism tested on the barn floor for alignment, he stood back and looked at it with a critical eye and then said, "That'll hold. It won't be pretty, but it'll plow." She stood beside him looking at it. "I am in your debt, Mr. Alden." "Josiah," he said, "and you're not in my debt. It was a favor. People don't do favors without wanting something." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and his eyes were a shade of gray-green that she had not noticed before, steady and direct. "Some people do," he said. "Not many, maybe, but some." She held his gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. Outside, a clap of thunder rolled across the foothills and the barn horses shifted in their stalls. "Will you stay for supper?" she asked. "It's the least I can offer." He glanced at the barn door where the rain was still streaming past in dark curtains. "I'd be grateful," he said. Beatrice Hale's kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and dried herbs and the particular good smell of a house that has been lived in hard and loved harder. She cooked a proper meal, salt pork and beans and cornbread from the cast iron skillet, and Josiah sat at the long pine table with Clarence and Pete, and did not try to dominate the conversation. He answered questions when they were put to him, and he ate with the focused appreciation of a man who had spent months eating his own trail cooking, and he complimented the cornbread twice, which made Beatrice quietly pleased in a way she did not examine. Clarence warmed to him faster than expected, which meant a great deal, because Clarence was a man who held his opinions about people like money in a locked box and did not hand them out easily. They talked horses for a while, and then trail conditions in the high country, and then Clarence told a long story about a summer he had spent working cattle drives up through New Mexico and Kansas in the 1870s. And Josiah listened to all of it with the genuine attention of a man who understood that old men's stories were rarely just stories. Pete said little, as was Pete's way, but he refilled Josiah's coffee cup without being asked, which in Pete's personal language was practically a declaration of affection. When supper was done and Clarence and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse, Beatrice and Josiah sat on opposite sides of the table with their coffee, and the rain still talking on the roof. "You said you came down for Red Haven," she said, "to sell your season's catch." "That's right. How long will you be in the territory?" He turned his cup slowly in both hands, and she noticed again how large they were, how the lamplight traced the old scars across his knuckles. "A week maybe, long enough to resupply and head back up. Back to the mountains." "Back to the mountains," he confirmed. She looked at her coffee. "You have a place up there, a cabin." "Two, actually. One in the high country that I use in summer, one lower that I winter in. Nothing much to look at, but they're solid." He paused. "I built them myself." She looked up at that. "You built them?" A man has to sleep somewhere. There was something in the simplicity of it that she found unexpectedly moving. The image of this large, self-contained man felling timber and notching logs in the high silence of the mountains because he needed a place to sleep, and because it simply had not occurred to him to ask anyone else to do it. "My father was like that," she said. "He said if you couldn't build it yourself, you didn't deserve to live in it." She smiled, just slightly. It changed her face considerably. She was attractive in a way that had nothing to do with artifice, strong-jawed and fine-eyed, with a kind of directness in her expression that most men found either appealing or unsettling, depending on how comfortable they were with being seen clearly. Josiah found it appealing. He had been noticing, in the small and careful way of a man who knew better than to move fast, the way she held herself, straight-spined and certain, even when she was visibly exhausted. The way she had stood in the rain over the broken plow without weeping or giving up. The way she had watched him work without interference or commentary, trusting him to do the thing he had said he could do. "What will you do?" he asked. "About the ranch." She was not offended by the directness. She appreciated it. "I'll manage," she said. "The bank," she looked at him. "I didn't say anything about a bank." "You didn't have to," he said quietly. "You're running this place on two hands and your own back, and your father's been gone less than a year by the look of it. There's always a bank involved." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, the note comes due in September. I need a good wheat crop and a cattle sale. If both go right, I can service the debt. If one of them doesn't," she stopped. She had not said this out loud to anyone. "I'll manage," she said again. "I believe you," he said, and meant it so plainly that her throat tightened. He slept in the barn that night over his own insistence. She had offered the spare room and he had thanked her and declined it, saying his horse was particular about strangers and he preferred to be close. She suspected it was courtesy of another kind, a mountain man's reading of the proprieties that mattered on a ranch where a woman lived alone, and she appreciated it without saying so. In the morning the rain had stopped and the world was washed clean, and the sky was the particular sharp blue that Colorado produced after a storm, the kind of blue that made you feel the altitude in your lungs. Josiah saddled his horse before she was even fully awake, and she found him in the yard when she came out with the coffee pot, already having fed and watered every animal in the barn. She stood on the porch and looked at him standing in the clear morning light and thought, with a directness that surprised her, that she had never seen a man who looked quite so entirely at home in the world outdoors. The mountains were in him, she thought. The way the light was in the morning, just present and inevitable and good. "You didn't have to do that," she said, nodding toward the barn. "Early riser," he said simply. She poured him a cup and handed it down from the porch, and he took it and drank it standing, and they were quiet together in the good morning quiet. "I'll be in Red Haven a week," he said after a while. "I know," she said. "You mentioned. There's a dry goods on the main street, Murphy's, if you needed to get a message to me for any reason." He said it carefully, not like an invitation, more like information left where she could find it if she chose to. "Why would I need to do that?" she said in the same careful tone. "You probably wouldn't," he said. He handed back the cup, gathered his reins, and stepped up into the saddle with the ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times. "Thank you for the supper, Beatrice." It was the first time he had used her name. It did something small and significant to the air between them. "Thank you for the plow, Josiah," she said. He touched the brim of his hat and rode out of the yard. She watched him go until the wagon track bent south and the trees took him, and then she stood for a moment longer with the empty coffee cup warm between her palms and the morning bright all around her. She was in Red Haven on the third day after. She had legitimate reasons to go. She needed lamp oil and salt and a new bolt of fabric, and she had to see Edmund Fowler at the feed store about the spring seed order. These were all real needs, real tasks. She told herself these things twice on the 3-mile wagon ride into town, sitting straight on the bench with her hands on the reins and her face composed, and she did not examine the fact that she had put on her good blue blouse instead of her work shirt. Red Haven, Colorado in the spring of 1883 was a town of approximately 400 souls, with 2 saloons, a church, a bank, a general store, a feed store, Murphy's Dry Goods, a small hotel called the Continental that had never seen a continent more continental than New Mexico, a jail with a part-time sheriff named Arlen Dodd, and the particular frontier town energy of a place that was trying hard to be permanent and was not yet certain it would succeed. The main street was broad and unpaved and turned the same red mud as Beatrice's fields when it rained, and the storefronts were a mix of proper frame buildings and things that were still essentially glorified tents. She did the feed store first, which was the most pressing errand, and Edmund Fowler gave her the spring seed order in the patient, careful way of a man who had known Thomas Hale for 20 years and felt the loss of him quietly and personally. He asked after her in a way that was kind without being pitying, and she answered in a way that was honest without being raw. She was coming out of Murphy's Dry Goods, her purchases wrapped in brown paper under one arm, when she nearly walked directly into Josiah. He was coming out of the apothecary 2 doors down, a paper-wrapped parcel of his own under one arm, and when he saw her he stopped with a look of genuine surprise that told her with some private relief that he had not engineered this meeting either. "Miss Hale," he said, and then catching himself, "Beatrice." "Mr. Alden," she said. "Josiah." They stood on the boardwalk looking at each other while a buckboard rolled past in the street and a dog investigated something under the hitching rail. "How is the plow holding?" he asked. "Clarence got it into the south field this morning," she said. "It held fine." He nodded. "Good." A pause. "Did you get what you needed here?" "Mostly." She shifted the parcel. "I still need to see about a few things." "I was going to get some dinner," he said. "The hotel does a noon meal. It's better than it looks." She considered this for a moment. "The hotel it is, then," she said. She would think later that this was probably the moment. Not the barn, not the rainstorm. This. The 2 of them walking into the Continental Hotel's modest dining room with its 6 tables, and its single-framed painting of a mountain lake that bore no resemblance to any mountain lake in Colorado, and sitting across from each other, and talking for 2 hours over a meal that was indeed better than it looked. He told her about the San Juan Mountains, about the elk meadows in summer, and the way the aspen went in autumn, about the rivers that ran so cold and clear you could see every stone on the bottom from 20 feet above. He told it with the understated love of a man describing something he held sacred, and she listened with her chin in her hand and her eyes quiet on him, and thought that she had never heard anyone talk about a landscape the way he did, as if the land itself were a living thing worth reverence. She told him about the ranch in the years of her childhood, about trailing behind her father on inspection rounds, learning to read the weather in the look of a horse's ears, learning which grass was sweet and which was sour, learning the names and characters of every creek and draw and outcrop on the 800 acres she now owned. She talked about her father with the particular clarity of someone who has had to make sense of a great loss, and has done so through love rather than through forgetting. "He never remarried," she said. "After my mother died, she went when I was 4, fever, and the ranch became everything. He said once that he poured into it what he couldn't put anywhere else, and it grew accordingly." "That sounds like a good man's grief," Josiah said. "It was." She looked at her hands. "He taught me everything he knew, which I think was his way of making sure he didn't leave me alone even when he did." The sun moved across the window, and she suddenly realized how long they had been sitting there, and she looked up at the slant of light and said, "Lord, I've talked your ear off." "I didn't mind it," he said, and his tone was so plainly sincere that she had to look away for a moment. When she drove home that evening, the parcel on the seat beside her and the late light long and golden across the fields, she was aware of a warmth in her chest that was unfamiliar and slightly alarming in the way of things that you recognize are about to change something. She went to town again on the 5th day. She did not bother lying to herself this time about why. He was sitting on the bench outside Murphy's when she arrived, a long piece of wood in his hands and a small knife working at it with patient strokes, making something she could not yet identify. He looked up when she tied the horse at the rail and stood and put the wood in his coat pocket, and his expression when he saw her was of a man who had been hoping for something and received it, and was trying not to show too much of that plainly. They walked along the edge of town where there was a stretch of level ground beside the creek, and the willows were budding out pale green, and the water was running high and fast with the snowmelt. He took off his coat and laid it on a flat rock for her to sit on, an old-fashioned gesture that she might have found fussy from another man, but from him felt simply natural, the instinct of someone accustomed to making what comfort he could from the resources immediately available. She sat and he sat beside her, not close but present, and they talked differently this time. Not the careful architecture of early conversations, more like people who had already agreed on something without quite saying what it was. "You'll go back up," she said. She was watching the water. "Next week." "That's what I had planned," he said. A moment passed. The creek ran over its stones with the particularly Colorado sound of cold, purposeful water. "Plans change sometimes," she said. "They do," he agreed. She looked at him then directly, which was her way, the way that made some men uncomfortable. He held her gaze with a steadiness that matched it. His eyes in the afternoon light were more green than gray, she thought, and she thought also that she was looking at him the way you look at something you are not certain you will see again and want to keep. "I haven't had anyone to talk to," she said. "Not about real things. Clarence and Pete are good men. But they are employees, and there is always a little bit of the boss and the hand between us no matter how much I value them. And the women in town are kind, but—" She stopped and pressed her lips together. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding like I'm asking you to stay, and I'm not asking that." "Beatrice," he said, and there was something in the way he said her name that made her stop entirely. "Why aren't you asking that?" She looked at him. "Because I'm not someone who asks people to rearrange their lives," she said. "And if someone wanted to," he said. She was very still. The creek ran on. Somewhere in the willows a red-winged blackbird called once, bright and territorial and sure. "You barely know me," she said. "I know more than I did 5 days ago," he said. "And I find that the more I know, the more I want to." She turned her face back to the water. Her heart was doing something brisk and uncoordinated in her chest, and she was grateful he could not hear it. "The ranch is everything to me," she said finally. "I need you to understand that. I can't be. The ranch is not something I'm willing to give up or compromise." "I know that," he said. "I've known it since you were standing in the rain over a broken plow. A woman who leaves does not stand in the rain over a broken plow." She laughed. It came out of her with a kind of surprised relief, a real laugh, the first one in a long time, and she pressed her hand to her mouth after as if she had not quite expected it. He watched her with something careful and warm in his expression. "I have a week's worth of resupply to do," he said. "Would it be all right if I came out to the ranch after? I can help with the spring work. Your hands could use another set." She looked at him. "You're offering to work my ranch." "I'm offering to be around," he said. "The work would be a side effect." She held his gaze for a long moment. There was nothing cunning in his face. There was nothing but the steady, unhurried honesty that she had first registered in the barn when he crouched in the mud and ran his hands along the broken plow with such intelligent care. A man who knew how to read what was broken and had the hands and the patience to fix it. "All right," she said. He came back out to the ranch on the day he had said he would, with his horse resupplied, and a set of good leather-working tools tied to the back of the saddle. And Clarence came out of the barn and looked at him, and then looked at Beatrice standing on the porch. And Clarence's old eyes went just slightly warm, and he turned back to the barn without saying a word. The spring on the Hale Ranch in 1883 was one of the most demanding seasons Beatrice could remember. The late rains had softened the ground enough that plowing was possible, but made every step to the field an effort in mud navigation. The wheat seed went in with the repaired plow, and Josiah drove it through the south field while Clarence drove a second through the east, and Pete and Beatrice harrowed and sowed behind them. And at the end of 3 days of hard work, 5 of the 800 acres were planted, and the rest would follow. Josiah worked with the focused and unbothered energy of a man to whom hard physical labor was simply the texture of existence. He did not complain about the mud or the cold mornings or the hours. He learned the rhythms of the ranch quickly and with a native intelligence that impressed Clarence, who told Beatrice on the 4th evening, leaning in the barn doorway with his arms crossed and his voice low, "That man knows how to be useful without making a noise about it. That's rare." "I know," Beatrice said. "You going to keep him?" Clarence asked. She gave him a look that she intended to be quelling. Clarence was unmoved by it. "I'm just asking," he said. In the evenings when the work was done and Pete and Clarence had gone to the bunkhouse, Josiah stayed on the porch or in the kitchen and talked with Beatrice. This had become a habit, and neither of them formally acknowledged it as such. He had taken up residence in the barn loft, over his own insistence and Beatrice's offer of the spare room, and the arrangement had a decorum to it that the people of Red Haven could not reasonably object to if they had known, though the people of Red Haven were beginning to suspect something, as small frontier towns always do, because small frontier towns run on gossip the way other machinery runs on oil. One evening she brought out the piece of wood he had been carving outside Murphy's, which he had apparently left on the porch bench, and held it out to him. He had completed it, she realized. It was a small hawk in flight, wings spread, carved in a single piece of dark wood with a patience and precision she had not expected. Every feather was individual, the eye was alive. "You made this," she said. "Something to do with my hands in the evenings," he said, taking it from her. "I've always done it. The mountains give you a lot of quiet and you need to fill it with something." "It's beautiful," she said honestly. He looked at it in his palm for a moment and then held it back out to her. "Keep it," he said. She looked at him. "Why?" "I made it in your town," he said. "While I was thinking about coming back here, so it belongs here." He paused. "It belongs to you." She took it. She kept it on the kitchen windowsill after that, and every morning she saw it in the early light. The weeks passed. May turned warm and the wheat began to show in thin green lines across the plowed ground, and the world smelled of good soil and blossom and the particular sweetness of Colorado spring. Josiah Alden stayed. He did not make a formal declaration of this. He simply did not leave, and the space he occupied on the ranch stopped feeling provisional and started feeling structural. He rechinked the gaps in the barn wall that had been letting cold air through all winter. He rebuilt a section of the south fence that had been listing since an early spring flood. He showed Pete a better system for organizing the tack room that Pete then claimed as his own idea, which Josiah allowed with a straight face. He rode the property line with Beatrice one bright Saturday morning, listening as she told him what each section of land was for, what it had been, and what she hoped to make it. And he asked real questions and gave real opinions, and treated her vision for the ranch with the respect due to someone who was not just a caretaker but an architect. She began to lean into conversations with him, in the way you lean into a wind that is blowing in the direction you want to go. He was the most interesting person she had been near in years, which was partly the mountain life and the scope of what he had seen, but partly, she knew, simply him. The particular quality of his mind, which was curious and direct and not afraid of complexity, which was patient with the things that deserved patience and quick about the things that didn't. He had opinions and he held them, but he listened to hers with such genuine attention that she never felt talked over. There was an evening in mid-May when a thunderstorm came down out of the mountains fast and mean, and Beatrice had to run out to bring in the horses from the near pasture before it broke. Josiah was already in the pasture when she got there, moving the animals with calm, efficient sweeps of his arms, speaking low to them in the way he had that made horses trust him immediately. They got all six into the barn just as the lightning started walking down the ridge, and the rain came in sideways. The barn door swung shut behind them, and they stood in the sudden relative quiet with their chests heaving, and the horses settling around them, and the rain making its hard noise on the roof. They were standing close, she realized, not accidentally. The horses had pressed them together in the narrow space between the stalls, and the moment was there, present and obvious, and neither of them moved away from it. "Beatrice," he said. "Josiah," she said, at the same time, and then they both stopped, and something that might have been a laugh moved through the space between them. He lifted one hand and pushed the wet hair back from her face, the back of his knuckles gentle against her cheek, and she was very still under the touch, the way you are still when something is happening that you have wanted and are afraid to disturb by wanting too visibly. His eyes were on hers, and they were very steady and very clear. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it carefully because you deserve care." "Say it then," she said. Her voice was lower than usual. "I came down from those mountains for a week to sell pelts and go back up," he said, "and I am no longer sure I'm going back up. At least not the same way, not alone." He paused. "You are the most remarkable woman I've encountered in my life, and my life has taken me a good many places. You are capable and honest, and you love this land with everything you have. And watching you every day on this ranch has made me understand something about myself that I was getting wrong." She was watching him with the same focused attention she had given him in the barn on the first afternoon, but something was different in her face now, something open. "What were you getting wrong?" she asked. "That the mountains were enough," he said. "That being alone in a big country was enough, that I didn't need to stop and be somewhere." He looked at her steadily. "I want to stop here." The rain came down hard outside, and the horses were warm around them, and the barn smelled of hay and earth, and the particular animal peace of a dry shelter in a wet world. She put her hand up and covered his where it rested against her cheek. "I was standing in the rain over a broken plow," she said softly, "and I thought I had never been so alone in my life. And then you walked across the field toward me, and the first thing I thought was—" She stopped. "What?" he said. "That you had kind hands," she said, which was absurd because I couldn't even see them yet, but that was what I thought. He looked at her for a long, still moment, and then he leaned down and kissed her. Gently and with intention, the way he did every other thing, without hurry and without uncertainty, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything. And the rain performed its loud percussion on the old barn roof, and neither of them particularly noticed. What happened next happened in the way of real things, not suddenly but steadily, like a river finding its course. Josiah rode to Red Haven the following week, and had a conversation with Edmund Fowler at the feed store, who was on the town council, and also the closest thing Red Haven had to a social conscience. And the conversation was brief and direct, and concerned whether there would be any reasonable objection to a mountain man of established character formally courting the widow Hale's daughter. And Edmund Fowler said that he could speak for himself in saying there would not be any objection at all. And in his personal opinion, the town would be fortunate to gain another permanent resident of that evident caliber. There was a woman named Viola Marsh who ran the post office and also ran the community's collective concern about its members' social propriety, and she had opinions about Josiah's arrangement at the Hale Ranch. She brought them to Beatrice's attention on a Tuesday afternoon when Beatrice was picking up mail, in the form of a carefully worded expression of concern for her reputation and her father's memory. Beatrice listened to Viola Marsh with polite attention and then said, with the same directness she brought to everything, that she respected Viola's concern and that Josiah Alden slept in the barn loft. that her hands Clarence and Pete were present on the property, and that she was 23 years old and the owner of 800 acres and accountable to herself and God, and not to anyone else's comfort. And she thanked Viola and took her mail and walked out. She told Josiah about it that evening, not upset, more amused, and he listened with a carefully contained expression that eventually broke into a grin, which was a rare enough thing on his face that when it appeared it altered his whole appearance, making him look younger and somewhat ungovernable. "Move to the spare room," she said. "That will satisfy Viola." "No," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I'll stay in the barn," he said, "until I can give you a better reason to offer me the spare room." He held her eyes with a meaningful steadiness that made something in her stomach turn over pleasantly. "I intend to ask you something, Beatrice. I'm working up to it at a reasonable pace." She studied him with the particular expression she wore when she was being amused against her will. "A reasonable pace," she repeated. "I'm a careful man," he said. "You fixed my plow in 3 hours," she said. "I knew what I was working with," he said. "I'm still learning you." She looked at him for a long moment. "You already know me," she said. "You've known me since the first afternoon in that barn. You knew me before I knew it." He was quiet, the serious and considering quiet that was his particular quality. "Yes," he said, "I expect that's true." "Then don't be too careful," she said. June came and the wheat was green and true, and the cattle, 12 head of mixed stock that represented the working animal capital of the ranch, were on the summer pasture and looking well. Josiah had helped Beatrice identify and fence a new section of pasture in the north quarter of the property that had better grass and a reliable stream, and the cattle on it were visibly improving, filling out in the shoulders in the way that meant a good sale in the fall. He built her a new fence along the kitchen garden, because the old one had been failing for 2 seasons, and the deer were helping themselves to her kitchen garden herbs with a brazenness that had finally become intolerable. He built it straight and solid, and with a gate that swung true, and she planted Sweet William along the inside of it because her father had grown Sweet William and she had missed it. One evening in late June they rode to the top of the east ridge of the property, where you could see the whole of the ranch laid out below, and if you turned west, the first serious ranks of the mountains beginning, shadowed and enormous and permanent. They sat their horses side by side in the cooling evening air and looked both ways for a long time. "Do you miss it?" she asked. She was looking at the mountains. "The high country." He was quiet for a moment. "I miss the quiet sometimes," he said. "But the quiet is different here than I expected." He glanced at her. "There's a kind of quiet in the evenings here, after the work is done and before dark, that I didn't expect to find." "It's the land," she said. "The land has its own quiet if you know how to listen for it." "I think it might also be the company," he said. She smiled without looking at him. They sat for a while longer, the horses shifting slightly under them, the evening coming down blue and gold across the mountains, and then Josiah reached into his coat pocket and held something out to her. She took it. It was a ring, small and honest, silver with a single piece of turquoise set simply, the kind of ring that a man with good hands and a jeweler's skill and no access to a jeweler's tools had made himself from what he had available. It was not elaborate. It was entirely right. She looked at it in her palm for a long moment. "I spent a fair amount of the month making that," he said. "The silver is from a belt buckle I had no use for. The stone I found on the creek bank last spring in the San Juans, and I've been carrying it around because I liked the color." She looked at him, the ring still in her palm. The evening light was on his face and he was watching her with the steady, clear attention that she had come to know was his equivalent of laying everything open. "Josiah," she said. "Beatrice," he said, "I would be honored if you would marry me. This ranch is yours and I have no wish to take anything from it or from you. I only want to be part of what you build here, to be here when the plows break and when the wheat comes up and when the weather is bad and when it's good. I want to be the man who is here." He paused. "If you'll have me." The sun was going down and the mountains were going purple, and far away a coyote was beginning its evening conversation with itself, and Beatrice Hale closed her fingers around the turquoise ring and said yes. They were married in September by the Reverend Calloway of the Red Haven Community Church, on a Saturday morning when the light was clear, and the aspens along the creek had gone their brilliant fall gold, and the air smelled of the good dry smell of harvest time. Clarence cried, which he denied immediately and thoroughly, and which no one believed. Pete stood very straight and held the small bouquet of wild aster and late-season goldenrod that Beatrice had cut herself that morning, and he handed it to her at the altar door with a gravity that suggested he understood the weight and significance of the occasion entirely. Viola Marsh was there. She wore her good hat and brought a jar of preserved peaches and told Beatrice afterward that she was very happy for her, and Beatrice thanked her with genuine warmth, because Beatrice was not the kind of woman who held grudges against well-meaning fussiness. The wheat had come in well. Not spectacularly, but solidly, and the cattle had sold at the fall market in Durango for a price that, combined with the harvest income, covered the bank note with enough remaining to carry the ranch through the winter with a little margin. Beatrice had gone to the Colton County Bank herself, on the day before the wedding, and paid the note in person to the banker, a careful man named Harrywell, who counted the money twice and gave her the receipt with an expression of faint surprise, because he had not been entirely confident she would manage it, and she had the particular satisfaction of proving a cautious man's doubts wrong. She did not tell Josiah about the bank until after it was done. He was quiet when she told him, reading the receipt she showed him, and then he looked up at her and his expression was one of such uncomplicated pride in her that she had to look away. "You did that," he said. "With help," she said, "from the plow forward. With your own hands and your father's land and your own brains," he said. "The plow was 30% of one day. The plow was everything," she said firmly. "If the south field hadn't gone in, none of the rest would have followed." She held his gaze. "You fixed it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "We fixed it," which she recognized as his version of meeting her exactly in the middle, and she accepted it. After the wedding, they had 2 days that were as close to a wedding trip as the ranch and the season allowed, riding north into the foothills where Josiah knew the country, and where there was a particular valley he had mentioned, with a creek and stands of aspen and a view of the peaks that he had said she would love. She did. They camped 2 nights and the weather was perfect, clear and crisp with stars so thick and low they seemed a personal extravagance. And Josiah built the kind of camp that a man who has lived outside for years builds, efficient and warm and somehow also comfortable. He cooked over the fire in the way he had, unhurried and capable, and she sat wrapped in a blanket and watched the peaks go rose-colored at sunset and felt, for the first time in a year that had asked a great deal of her, entirely and simply at rest. They came home to the ranch on the 3rd day, and life resumed. The first winter of their marriage was the winter Josiah proved himself to Clarence in a definitive and unambiguous way. In February, a blizzard came down off the mountains that was unusual even by Colorado standards. 3 days of driving snow and wind that kept everyone in and buried the fence lines and made the world a single, undifferentiated white. On the second night of it, one of the mares dropped a foal, early and under bad conditions, and the foal was down, and the mare was in distress, and Clarence came pounding on the ranch house door at 2 in the morning. Josiah was already pulling on his boots. He and Clarence and Beatrice spent 4 hours in the barn with the mare and foal in the middle of that blizzard, working by lantern light, and Josiah was steady and sure, and did what needed doing without flinching or hesitating. And at the end of it the foal was up and nursing and the mare was calm and breathing well, and Clarence sat down on a hay bale and looked at Josiah and said, "You'll do," which coming from Clarence was a form of high praise that Josiah received with a nod and a quiet, "Thank you." They named the foal February, which was Pete's idea, and it was a good name. Spring came again, and with it the second planting, and this year there were 4 hands instead of 2, because Josiah hired on a young man from Red Haven named Daniel who was 18 and big and willing and needed the work. And with the four of them, the spring work went faster and farther than the year before. They put wheat into the south and east fields and corn into the north quarter where the soil was different, and they expanded the kitchen garden, because Beatrice had plans for it that included more than just herbs and kitchen vegetables. Josiah spent the winter evenings carving. He made her a set of cabinet pulls for the kitchen from dark walnut, shaped like trailing vines, which he installed one February Sunday while she made bread, and when she turned around and saw them, she stopped entirely with her hands white with flour and looked at them and then at him and said, "When did you do all that?" And he said, "Evenings." And she kissed him on the cheek with her floury hands, and he turned slightly red and then smiled, the rare and ungovernable smile. He still thought about the mountains. She knew this. She would have known it even if he had never said it, because it was in him the way the mountains themselves were in the West, permanent and clear, and she did not want to be the thing that asked him to deny it. So when, in the second April of their marriage, he told her he wanted to spend a month in the high country before the spring work became fully consuming, setting his old lines and checking his winter cabin, she said, "Go, then," with a steadiness that cost her something privately but that she meant entirely, and he looked at her with a gratitude that was also something deeper than gratitude. He was gone 3 weeks and came back with 2 horses packed with pelts and something she had not expected. A small, smooth piece of dark green mountain stone that he pressed into her palm when he kissed her hello, saying that he had found it in the high meadow, and it was exactly the color of the wheat in June, and he had thought of her. She put the stone on the kitchen windowsill beside the hawk he had carved in Red Haven and looked at both of them in the morning light. He went to the mountains once a year after that. 3 weeks in the spring before planting. It was a good arrangement. The kind of arrangement that works because both people in it understand what the other needs and do not resent it. She used the weeks for work she did without him seeing, repairs to the house and improvements to the garden, and one spring a new reading chair for the main room that she had ordered from a craftsman in Durango, and that she presented to him when he returned as casually as if it had always been there, though the pleased expression she failed to fully suppress betrayed her. He sat in it that evening for the first time, and looked around the room from this new angle with an expression of such profound and simple contentment that she memorized it. In November of 1884, 14 months after their wedding, their first child was born, a boy. He came into the world with considerable noise and personal confidence, and Josiah held him in the first minutes with enormous careful hands and looked down at the red, furious, perfect face with an expression that Beatrice, exhausted and still, watched from the bed and thought she would carry forever. "Thomas," she said. It was not a question. Josiah looked at her. His jaw was tight in the way it went when he was managing something strongly felt. "Thomas," he confirmed. Thomas Alden grew quickly and loudly, and with his father's dark hair and his mother's directness of eye, and he wanted to be in the barn from the moment he could walk, and under his father's feet from the moment after that. Josiah handled this with the patient competence of a man who had never considered that children were anything other than small people who deserved to be taken seriously, and so Thomas was taken seriously, and the result was a boy who was both confident and kind, which was, Beatrice thought, about the best result you could aim for. Clarence died in the summer of 1885. Not dramatically, not of anything you could name precisely, but of the slow and dignified shutting down of a very old man who had worked hard his entire life and was at last simply finished with working. He died in his bunk in the bunkhouse on a warm July night, and Pete found him in the morning, and the whole ranch stood still for a day in his honor. He was buried on the ranch, on the east ridge where you could see both the mountains and the fields, and Josiah stood beside Beatrice through the burial with his hand at the small of her back, and she was grateful for the weight of it. She wept for Clarence, the first time she had wept in front of Josiah, and he did not try to stop her or to fix it, only stood with her and let the grief be real, and that was the right thing to do. They hired 2 new hands the following spring, brothers named Marcus and Roy Teller from a ranch further south whose owner had sold out and moved to Denver. They were good workers, and Roy had an inexplicable gift with horses that made him invaluable almost immediately. And Pete, who had moved from 40-something to approximately 50-something during these years, took a kind of senior hand authority that suited him, and that the Teller brothers respected without much fuss. The ranch grew. Not extravagantly, not with the speed of speculation or luck, but with the steady accumulation of good decisions and hard work, and the particular kind of management that happens when 2 intelligent people are working toward the same thing and have the sense not to get in each other's way. Beatrice handled the finances and the strategic decisions about what to plant and where with an acumen that impressed even Harrywell at the Colton County Bank, who had long since converted his initial doubts about the Hale Ranch's survival into a respectful assessment of it as one of the sounder agricultural operations in the county. Josiah managed the physical infrastructure of the ranch with the same steady intelligence he had brought to the broken plow, identifying what needed doing it well, and not making noise about it. They argued sometimes. Real arguments, the kind that come from 2 people who have strong opinions and care about the outcome. Once badly, about a decision to expand the cattle operation that Beatrice wanted to make and Josiah thought was too fast. And for 3 days they were careful and cool with each other in a way that was its own kind of weather. On the 4th day he came in from the barn at noon and found her at the kitchen table with the ledgers spread before her and her forehead in her hands, and he sat down across from her and said, "I might be wrong about the cattle," and she looked up and said, "I might be moving too fast," and they talked it through differently after that, and the decision they arrived at together was better than either of them had had alone. She told him once, on a winter evening by the fire, Thomas asleep in the next room and the snow piling soft and quiet outside, that she had been afraid when he first said he wanted to stay, afraid of what it meant to need someone. It was quiet for a moment, his hand around a cup of coffee, the firelight on his face. "Were you afraid of needing someone," he said, "or afraid of losing someone else?" She looked at him. He was always doing this, finding the more exact question. "Both," she said, "the same." He reached across and took her hand. His hand covered hers completely, the way it always did, big and scarred and warm. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "The mountains will keep for a few weeks a year and come back to me. I'm here the rest of the time. I'm here, Beatrice." She turned her hand over and held his. "I know," she said. "I know you are." Their second child came in the spring of 1887. A girl this time, arrived with considerably less fanfare than Thomas, but with a quiet watchfulness in her dark eyes that Josiah said reminded him of the way hawks looked at the world, which Beatrice noted was high praise coming from him. They called her Clara, after no one in particular, because the name suited her face, and she seemed to arrive already knowing who she was. Thomas regarded Clara with the suspicious gravity of a 2-year-old who has been the unchallenged center of a household, and has suddenly discovered that this status is contingent. But he adapted, as children do when they are secure, and within a month was fiercely protective of her, in the way of older brothers who have decided the situation is now their responsibility. Josiah taught Thomas to track that summer, pointing out the signs in the soft ground around the creek, showing him how deer walked differently from cattle, how to read the story that a patch of disturbed earth told. Thomas was 3.5 and should have been too young for it, but he was attentive in the way his mother was attentive, with a quality of focused interest that made the small things worth explaining. They would come back to the ranch house at the end of these excursions with mud on their boots and some piece of knowledge between them, and Beatrice would watch them come through the kitchen door and feel something in her chest so vast and warm that she could not name it precisely and did not try. The railroad came through Colton County in 1888. Not through Red Haven itself, which was too far south, but through Castellan, 18 miles north, and the new spur changed the economics of the whole region in ways that were both good and complicated. The good: cattle could go to market faster and in better condition, and prices improved noticeably. The complicated: it brought new settlers, new demand for land, and new attention from speculators in Denver and back east who saw the territory's agricultural potential, and were not always subtle about how they intended to capitalize on it. One of these speculators was a man named Garrett Cole, who rode out to the Hale Ranch one Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1888 with a man from a land office in Denver, and an offer for the property that was genuinely generous by the standards of the time. He sat in Beatrice's kitchen with his good suit and his practiced smile and his paperwork, and he laid it all out clearly and courteously, and to his credit, he seemed to understand fairly quickly that the woman across the table from him was not going to be flattered or pressured, because she simply looked at the paperwork and then looked at him and said, "No." He tried again. He was persistent, which was presumably how he had gotten where he was. She said, "This ranch is not for sale, not for this price, not for twice this price. My father built this land. My husband and I are building on it. It will pass to my children. This conversation is over." Cole looked at Josiah, who had come in from the barn during the conversation and was standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed. Cole looked at him for a long moment in the way of a man taking stock of a situation and deciding the arithmetic did not favor him. He tipped his hat and left. Josiah closed the door behind him and looked at Beatrice. "You were polite," he said. "I'm always polite," she said. "Right up until I'm not." He smiled. The rare and ungovernable one. That was the last they heard of Garrett Cole, though the railroad brought others with different and sometimes more interesting propositions over the following years, and Beatrice dealt with all of them with the same clear-eyed efficiency she had turned on the first. The ranch reached its mature form by 1890. 1,200 acres now, having added a section to the north when a neighbor sold out and moved to Oregon, with 3 full-time hands, the Teller brothers and a young man named Henry who had come out from Kansas with his family and stayed. A solid cattle operation, 60 head of good stock. The wheat and corn fields in rotation, managed with a discipline that kept the soil from wearing out the way so many other fields in the county were wearing out. A new well, dug by Josiah and Henry in the summer of 1889, with the particular determination of men who have decided a thing needs doing and have cleared their schedule accordingly. And the house. Josiah had rebuilt it over 2 winters, not replacing it but expanding it, adding rooms and a proper covered porch and a new kitchen with a better chimney. He worked on it in the evenings after the ranch work was done, the way he worked on everything, methodically and well. And when it was done, it was the house the original Hale house had always been trying to become. The sweet William grew along the garden fence and climbed the porch posts, and in June it was extraordinary. Thomas was 6 in 1890, tall for his age and already useful on the ranch in the small but genuine ways of a child who has been brought up in work and understands its dignity. Clara was 3 and possessed of an opinion about everything, and a vocabulary that consistently surprised adults who had not yet learned to take her seriously, a mistake that was never made twice. Beatrice was 30 years old and at the height of her particular beauty, which was the beauty of a woman in full possession of herself and her life. Josiah was 34, still built like something the mountains had assembled, still with the quality of stillness and the quality of directness, and the quality of being utterly, fundamentally present. On a September evening in 1890, they sat on the porch together after supper, Thomas reading beside the lamp they had brought outside for him, Clara asleep across Josiah's lap, with the complete physical trust of a small child who has never had reason to doubt the arms holding her. The mountains were going dark to the west, and the stars were beginning above the foothills and the field spread before them, still and silver in the early evening light. Beatrice had been quiet for a long time in the companionable way they had perfected over 7 years of marriage. Then she said, "I was standing in the rain over a broken plow." Josiah looked at her. He was doing the thing he did, the slight lifting of one corner of his mouth that was a smile before it became a smile. "You were," he said. "I thought I was completely alone," she said. "I know," he said. "And then you walked across the field," she said, "in the mud, for no reason at all." "I had a reason," he said. "What was it?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. "Because you were standing there so straight," he said. "In the rain, over a broken thing, and you weren't running. That's not something you walk past." She looked at him with the steady, open look that she had once worried she might never find someone worth giving it to fully. He met it with the steadiness that was his, that the mountains had grown in him, and that she had been the first person to find genuinely restful. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." The lamp threw its circle of warm light around their little piece of porch. Clara breathed in her father's arms. Thomas turned a page. The mountains held their dark and beautiful patience in the west. The wheat fields, 3 months harvested and turned under for the winter, lay quiet and faithful and ready for the spring, which would come, as it always did, and find the ground prepared. Beatrice Hale leaned her head onto her husband's shoulder, and Josiah Alden, who had come down out of the mountains for a week and never quite gone back, put his arm around her and held the evening close. Below them the creek talked in its language of stones and cold water. The sweet William was done for the season, but its stalk stood faithful at the fence. And somewhere on the east ridge, in the place where Clarence lay, the last of the day's light was finding the peaks and turning them the color of everything good and worth building toward. There would be more seasons. Another child, as it happened, born in the winter of 1891. A second boy they named Henry after the hand who had become a genuine friend, which pleased Henry so much that he was incapacitated for the better part of an afternoon and had to sit down in the tack room. The railroad connection would change markets and create new opportunities and require new thinking, and Beatrice would provide it. The ranch would face drought in 1893 and come through it because of the careful water management Josiah had put in place in the years before. Thomas would eventually grow into a young man who had his mother's intelligence and his father's hands, and who would one day inherit 800 acres and know what to do with them because he had been taught well. But on this September evening in 1890, none of that had happened yet, and it did not need to. The evening was complete in itself, the way good things are complete in themselves, the way a field is complete when the last seed is in the ground and the rain comes, the way a forge fire is complete when the iron comes out true, the way a broken thing is complete when the hands that know how to hold it find it. The stars came out over the Hale ranch one by one and then all at once, which is how they always came, and the darkness settled gentle on the mountains and the fields and the house and the people in it, and everything that had been broken was mended, and everything that had been planted had grown, and everything that had been hoped for was here.